And then, of course, 10 seconds after that, all the tile manufacturers and distributors that were buying much cheaper said, well, I'm going to go in there with a lower price. And so you had a combination of, paver reps that were selling porcelain pavers and not really knowing the installation nuances from one material to the other.
Okay.
And tile guys coming in and snaking that business on price and having no idea how to install
Well, I was
porcelain.
going to say that's a total mismatch of environments to lay in,
A
and
lot of similarities from one installation to the next, but some significant differences, right?
well, and it's funny that you talk about that in particular because I remember in the UK, about 15 years ago, everybody started laying porcelain paving.
Mhm.
And at first they were recommending that it had to be, you had to pour a concrete slab and
Mhm.
then you had to bond to that. And then you're like, well, that's kind of an expensive way to install it. So do we have to do it
Mhm.
like, so again, we went through those iterations as well. But I don't think in the UK I left about 4 years ago, but we were not doing unbonded porcelain paving.
Correct.
So,
UK is almost completely bonded to a thick mortar bed.
yeah, yeah. And so it so do you think that, well, I guess I'm just wondering, that the methods that we were using there didn't translate very well to come over here from an education point of view, maybe, if they're using it's an Italian porcelain and coming over and that was another barrier to
Yeah,
entry or
I think so. And I don't want to talk out of school about things I don't know for fact.
mm,
But I think that a lot more of the installers in UK were already doing like and similar methods with natural stone.
yes.
And I think that in the US, the bulk of the hardscape market is guys dry laying concrete pavers.
Well, I guess that's what I'm thinking too. It
So it's
does
a little bit of
seem
a further step from current practices.
well, that's good that you say that because I guess that's my impression too.
Yeah.
Like, it does seem like in Europe we are laying a lot more natural stone and it is all bonded and yeah,
Yeah.
and so it's not that different. I think the problems that we were seeing, I guess, 10 years ago was cutting it
Yeah.
was a big deal. And we did a lot of curves in our designs. And so that made the
Mhm.
porcelain like a lot more wasteful or yeah, harder to deal with on site. Like we couldn't cut it on site, but that's changed a lot too recently, hasn't it?
Correct. As long as you've got the right saw and the right saw blade, and then you're using the right technique with the saw blade and not just trying to jam through it as fast as you can. Most porcelain should cut just fine. It
Hmm.
just is slower and it's a little bit rougher on the blade. So when you're figuring out your cost, you have to take that into consideration. That's all.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and so I saw recently, was it on LinkedIn or Facebook that you put a question?
It was
Um,
Facebook. It was
was it
Facebook.
Facebook? Okay. Because I thought that was like, so I moved here 4 years ago. I just said that a few minutes ago, but I thought, I'm looking around. I'm in South Louisiana, and I'm like, there's there's not as many options with hardscape materials as I'm used to seeing.
Right.
And just really, still a lot of concrete driveways, poured concrete,
Mhm.
which I know, I mean, in Scotland, we have freeze thaw cycles and it's spalling and, it's more problematic to do poured concrete outside. And so I realized that, but I'm surprised around, so porcelain paving, what I like so much about it is that as opposed to some of the natural stones in a slipperiness. Like I love natural stone, I love the look of it, but it can be really slippy. Like in Scotland, we had a lot of slate paving,
Mhm.
and it looks really sharp. But if it's on a grade, it can be lethal. And so
Mhm.
again, I like that porcelain paving has this. you know, the characteristic that you design to is to keep it from being slippy. So what, are you seeing a lot of porcelain paving around pools and those kind of areas?
Yeah, we absolutely are. And I'm glad that you brought up the slip and skid resistance of porcelain, because it does vary in terms of the test methodology from one part of the world
Oh,
to the next, right?
okay.
So in the US, we use something called dynamic coefficient of friction as the measure for whether or not it's going to be safe for use in a given area, right? If it's a commercial kitchen, if it's a shower floor, or if it's an outdoor commercial wet area sloped with minimal footwear, like a hotel swimming pool that's outside,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So that's out there, and the measure that we use per industry standard is dynamic coefficient of friction, or DCOF. And per a newer ANSI standard 326.3, the recommended standard, I know, sorry,
I was like,
for
whoa.
outdoor, I have to, right?
Okay.
For outdoor wet areas is a minimum DCOF of 0.55. Now, there's a lot of tiles in the market from India and Europe, especially, and a lot of them are under the R system. So a lot of them will say we're R11, so we're good for outside. Unfortunately, it may be, right? May be good for outside, but it has to pass the DCOF test, because
As well.
if not, and somebody has a slip and fall and they want to sue, and then they test, and yeah, it meets R11, but it doesn't meet DCOF, then there's still liability. There's still liability for the owner, the distributor, the installer. I mean, everybody,
Yeah. Well, and
everybody.
how do
So
they compare or do,
there's
or is
there's no
it
direct comparison, because the test methodology is different,
so
right? They don't
different?
test for the same thing. So there's no crossover chart for R11 equals whatever DCOF. Doesn't exist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So as an
That's
importer, just be
huge.
careful, right? Because we
Yeah.
import at Daltile, we import 14 SKUs for stock in the US from our sister company, Marazzi, in Italy. But
Yeah.
every single one is tested to the DCOF standard with right test methodology. The Bot 2000, it's like a little robot car that just measures the resistance. There's not a whole lot to it, but it's the one that the industry uses. And then that reminds me too,